Anna from NHCSR here. I recently made a video summarizing some of the added benefits to buying organic. And I did pose the question, could you get the same thing if you spent that money on local produce? I made a lot of bold assumptions about what people were looking for when they are paying a little bit extra to buy local. These were all kind of my best guess based on my personal experience in New England. But the folks at UNH's food lab went out to ask the same question, and them being the professionals they are, did a much more thorough job. So I wanted to do a little summary of this paper and see if some of my assumptions were correct. And it turns out that I was kind of right and I was kind of wrong about a few things. And of course, the devil's in the details. I think this paper also turns out to be a really good example of how differently, I think, than folks from this team who used some of the tools and tactics used in sociology to answer questions about how people think and feel and how different groups respond differently to different words and terminology. Very cool stuff. So I'm always looking at what you can measure with a number, right? So they are looking at answering the same question, what attributes are important to New England consumers, but they are doing many more things to find connections between these different groups. So let's dig into this paper, because what's really cool about this work is that they didn't make it easy on themselves and just go to the farmer's market or go to the local farm stand to ask people why buying local was important to them. They wanted to expand this question to the general populace. I'm sure that information would be of benefit to farmers to have a little bit of nuanced understanding about why their customers found value in their product. But farmers and me, we want to know what the other folks are doing too. Like, why aren't they buying local? So here's what they did. So the folks at the food lab used a mixed methods approach to investigate food attribute preferences among New Englanders, combining a large-scale representative survey and in-depth interviews, and that's to capture what attributes are important to the larger population in New England, and then these in-depth interviews to tease out why. The population-based survey, this was very interesting to me because I've never done anything like this before. There's a lot of thoughtful little twists. Their sampling strategy used a probability-based sampling method to ensure results were representative of the general population. They were sending everybody to the same survey, the New England Food Shopping Habits and Preferences Survey, which was a web-based survey that was administered between November 2022 and March 2023. But in order to make sure they had all their bases covered, they used 3 different approaches. Phase 1 was to send text messages to 150,000 randomly selected cell phone numbers with a link to this survey. So this included numbers that had New England area codes, but it also included cell phones that were in New England. So they were using towers that were in New England. This is to capture people like me, who I live in New England, I buy things in New England, but I have a cell phone number that I got in grad school, however many years ago from some other part of the world. Phase 2, they sent actual paper mail to make sure that they had a really consistent address-based sampling method. So there was a link to the survey on those paper mailers. Also, because they wanted to reach the broadest audience possible, they recognized that lower income adults are more likely to use prepaid cell phones. So they sent that same text message to 300,000 prepaid cell phones that they think were active in New England. They were pretty successful. They got 2,110 people to complete this survey, with an analytical subpopulation of about 1,800 for the primary attribute analysis. So this is basically all of the responses that passed the initial screening test. And it wasn't a very fine screening test. I think it was mainly whether or not they were adults, if the respondent said that they were over 18 and confirmed that they were actually located in New England. I think some people were kicked out of that because they were other places, or they were kids. All of these data ended up being weighted according to a ranking method based on their sex, age, education, race, ethnicity, and state, keeping in mind the community survey standard targets. So they did a bunch of math. And then they followed this up with in-depth interviews, 35 interviews, structured interviews that they collected over Zoom. And they did this because they could record those conversations and use the transcript to do some coding the transcripts of these interviews. The way that they do this quantitative analysis, they'll have multiple members of the team coding those interviews using different words and phrases and making connections. And they use some software to see how well the team agreed. They had 83% agreements across all codes, indicating high consistency. So 3 people with 3 different opinions ranked these things as important topics that came up during these interviews. Here's the breakdown of what they found from their survey. What actually matters to shoppers? So obviously, if you go to a local farmer's market and ask if buying local is important to them, they're going to say yes. They've already proved that with their being there and buying local. But while buying local does get a lot of buzz, it isn't the top priority for most of the people, or at least most of the people who answered this survey. The heavy hitters are much more practical when you're thinking about what attributes people are looking for. Foods that the family likes to eat and taste are right on top. That makes sense. High quality, health, and affordability were ranked as very important. And some of the surprises, at least for me, were that terms like being certified organic, grown on a small farm, knowing your farmer, these were ranked pretty low. Digging in a little bit deeper as far as variable responses to different terms that they used here. They would have, some terms that kind of mean the same thing or kind of have different connotations depending on who you're talking to. Terms like local and sustainable have become so flexible and mean something different to everybody. According to some of the interviews they did, it sounded like some of the folks thought local just meant the grocery store down the street. So like local had more to do with like where you get it versus where it was grown. There was some confusion there. Also, sustainability was certainly a mystery. People interpreted sustainable as everything from good for the planet to good for my household budget. So like that makes a lot of sense. Not only was organic certification ranked low as an attribute, many of these folks who were interviewed expressed a lack of trust in what the organic label means, often seeing that it's just a pricey marketing term that doesn't necessarily mean that the food is healthier. Of course, money came up, and the team were very thoughtful about including several different words that mean slightly different things when it comes to cost. Researchers found a specific nuance in how people talked about cost. So affordable versus inexpensive. People love affordable food, right? So 77% found that this was important, but they were wary of inexpensive food. Only 59% found this important. So the whole cheap association, shoppers admitted in interviews that when they need to save money, they often associated the word inexpensive with lower quality or poor nutrition. So the trade-off here, many participants felt that they had to choose between their values, like health or local support, and their bank account, sacrificing the former because of financial barriers. I think that makes sense. So the takeaway for farmers, local farmers who are trying to expand their clientele, I think it's very easy. Focus on how tasty, how high quality, how healthy, how bang for your buck your product is. That will reach the greatest number of people locally. So there aren't a lot of surprises here, but I think that the confusion about all these different terminologies and how different people respond to different words differently is really helpful with understanding what people are looking for when they're shopping local.